Welcome to week 7, Introduction to Psychology. We're going to look at learning. And learning is actually a very interesting topic when it comes to psychology because it looks at a lot of history of how we viewed how do we learn, or if you want, switch it around, and how we teach others and how we get it into, make things understandable to each other. So we're going to look at what is the definition of learning. We're also going to look at some of the history that still applies to today. Classical conditioning. This is done by Pavlov initially, and then we're going to move into operant conditioning, which is looking at Skinner, and operant conditioning looks at the significance of what the role of consequences are. And when we look at consequences, we have to also consider reinforcements, positive reinforcements, negative reinforcements, and what do they do to help us in terms of our learning. And then we're going to look at schedules of reinforcement. That is, how do we deliver it and what kind of pace or ratio do we give it out in. We're also going to look at observational learning. How is it that we learn by watching others? And this is going to set us up very well for the next chapter we'll do after the reading week, which will be memory. Okay, so good luck with this, and I hope your learning goes well.
Okay, let's look at learning then. So let's see, we have a definition, so we might want to ask ourselves a simple question. What is learning? Well, it's a relatively permanent change in behavior, knowledge, capability, or even attitude. And so when you think about it, it's what you're doing, what you used to do, and finding a new way. Now, what's important about this is that it's acquired through experience. So it can't be attributed to either an illness or an injury or maturation. It can't be. So children who grow up, they will get skill sets because of getting older, and that's called maturation. So it can't be connected to that. So infants don't learn how to walk. It's a basic motor skill, and maturation governed by every species, so it's not considered to be learning. So learning is anything that you learn to do behaviorally, knowledge-wise, capability, or attitude. Now when we think back in terms of when was it first started to be looking at it, it's called classical conditioning. And in this classical conditioning, it was discovered by accident actually during what would be a saliva experiment. Now, classical conditioning is the form of learning in which associations are made between stimulus and between two different stimuli. So here you've got a coffee and stimulus of Tim Hortons. When I see that driving down the road, those stimuli together are associated with one another. So when I see Tim Hortons, it connects me with the desire for coffee. A stimulus is any other or any event or object in the environment. So in the experience of Pavlov, who did the experiment originally, so now there's the association being made between those two things. And my learned response is, I'm happy. I'm happy with my coffee. I'm happy that the Tim Hortons was there. And so the association of two stimuli produces a learned response that I associate Tim Hortons with happiness because coffee's there. Now Pavlov, he originally did this saliva experiment with dogs, but accidentally discovered that while the dogs were having a salivary response, it was occurring just before the presentation of foods. Well, some of the association that the dogs were making weren't just to the food, but they could hear the footsteps of the lab assistants. They heard the food dishes rattle. They saw that the attendant who fed them and spotted their food. And so there was this association being made between these different stimuli. Now, if you have an animal at home, you know that you don't have to say too much or do very much for that animal to know that they're about to be fed. And that's the association being made between maybe the words that you said, "Are you ready for your supper?" or that you started making noise in the kitchen that sounds like I'm being fed. And so those associations get triggered. Now, in the process of classical conditioning, there's two different elements, and we're going to talk more than just about the two, but there's an unconditioned response and there's an unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that elicits a specific unconditioned response without ever learning it. So food, for example, you don't learn to recognize and have a response of hunger and salivation perhaps, or yummy, yummy, yummy when you see food. That comes without learning. It's an unconditioned stimulus. You don't have to be taught to do that. So things like food, loud noises, light in your eye, or the puff of air that you get puffed in your eye when you go to the optometrist, you don't have to learn to blink. It occurs. Now the unconditioned response, on the other hand, this is the unlearned response that automatically elicited from the unconditioned stimulus. So when food is presented, you salivate. So when a dog is presented with food, they will salivate. This also could be the startled response, the contracted pupils to light, or your light blink response. And so this would be the unconditioned response versus the unconditioned stimulus. Now, if I'm going to be learning something, making an association with the Tim Hortons sign to the taste and flavor and the smell of coffee, then that becomes, the Tim Hortons sign becomes a conditioned stimulus. So a conditioned stimulus is a previously neutral stimulus that eventually produces the conditioned response, my love for coffee and my desire to pull into a Tim Hortons coffee shop, after being associated with the unconditioned stimulus. So we make those connections between the unconditioned stimulus, my response to coffee maybe, and the Tim Hortons sign, or Starbucks sign for that matter. Then we have a conditioned response. This is the learned response, so my love for coffee. Could be a conditioned response as well. A learned response, that is where the conditioned stimulus occurs and is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so when we say the word in psychology, if I say to you, we're in a classroom, and I go psychology, the word is a conditioned response, or conditioned stimulus. It's paired with a loud noise. I slam a book down on the table, that's an unconditioned stimulus. So then I start to make the association that the word psychology produces a loud noise. That if I'd repeated this several times, the startled response that you would get by my slamming the desk with the book would produce a startled response. That startled response could be the conditioned response to my saying psychology. That is to say, I would say psychology, you'd startle even if I didn't slam a book. So for example, let's say you're at work and your boss criticizes you at work. So your unconditioned response to your boss's criticism, the boss's criticism is unconditioned stimuli. It's not automatic, you know what to do, but when you get this criticism, you start to feel tension, high blood pressure might occur, and so that's an unconditioned response. You didn't think about it and learn how to respond to your boss's criticism. Then in conditioning, so if we were to condition you, we would pair the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So in that case, what we would pair would be, anytime you talk about your boss, this is the conditioned stimulus that we're going to be adding, and the unconditioned stimulus, it's being paired with your boss's criticism. So whenever you talk about, your boss at work was telling everybody about all the good work they did, you still have the unconditioned stimulus of the boss's criticism in your head, and it produces the unconditioned response of tension and high blood pressure, even though you're talking about something good. So when we think about this conditioning experience, there is factors that can influence classical conditioning. The number of pairings of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. The more we pair them, the stronger the learning will be. The intensity of the unconditioned stimulus, that is to say, the unconditioned stimulus, how important is it? How strong emotionally are we attached to it? How reliable the conditioned stimulus is to predict the unconditioned stimulus. So the more it's connected, the more likely we are to learn it. So there's a lot of elements to conditioning, and yet this is a very strong way in which we make learning happen. Now, in the classical conditioning experiences, there are a few points that we can make. Now, there are some terms that we can do under classical conditioning, and the first we'll start with is generalization. This is where other stimuli similar to the original produce or elicit a similar response similar to the conditioned response. So even though I get the same, I've conditioned my Tim Hortons to coffee, I can generalize it to Starbucks as well. Now, I could also, the other term that's involved is called discrimination. And this is where we learn to respond to some things and not others. So for example, I might, as a way of discriminating my coffee or making the choice about what coffee I would prefer to buy, I might discriminate against all coffees and say, well, I'm really most interested in organic or fair trade. I'm not as interested in latte or decaf. So I've discriminated against, if you will, latte and decaffeinated. Now, it's important to note that discrimination here doesn't mean what you think it or what you normally associate with discrimination. Discrimination means I've made a selection among many stimuli. Think of a multiple choice test question. You are discriminating which is the correct one, so by selecting B, which is correct, you've discriminated that as being, you've made a discriminated choice between that and all the others as being the most correct answer. So discrimination in classical conditioning does not mean what it typically means when you talk about discriminating against a group of people. Now I could also look at a term that's called extinction. And this is where we lessen the conditioned response in the absence of the unconditioned response over time. So I can extinguish, if you will, I can extinguish my love for coffee and decreasing my conditioned stimuli, the unconditioned stimuli, or for that matter, I can lessen the conditioned response to my emblems of Tim Hortons and Starbucks by reducing my intake of coffee and getting away from coffee. You can start to extinguish the conditioned response. And then lastly is what's called spontaneous recovery. And this is where a conditioned response can occur again after a time delay between when it's been last experienced. So for example, war veterans and a backfiring of a car or the loud sounds can remind them of something that occurred quite a while ago, and so they have a spontaneous recovery of sheltering or looking for safety when those noises occur. Okay, let's carry on with another theorist that built off of classical conditioning, and this is where John Watson, he thought, well, maybe we can condition emotional circumstances. And so he initiated an experiment to prove fear could be classically conditioned. And he did this in 1919 in an experiment that has been since labeled Little Albert. And really what he was doing was he was conditioning Albert to be afraid of white rats and other white objects. And what he did is he had a rat which had no stimulus response from him. He didn't have a conditioned response. He saw a white rat, it was just that. But then he paired it with a loud noise, and it produced a fear reaction to little Albert. And so over time, the conditioned stimulus, the white rat, became a conditioned response of fear. The noise didn't need to be provided. He had associated the loud noise with the rat, and so that rat started to produce a fear reaction. And so we can look at a lot of our learning to have been done this way through different conditions. You think of phobias. Some of the things that we would describe as a phobia have been conditioned. So let's look at some classically conditioning experiences in daily life. So perhaps our fear responses could be considered classically conditioned. Your dental visits, the smell of the office, the sound of the drill, the sight of the chair, all could produce a fear response. For people who experience drug recovery, the conditioned stimulus associated with drug use leads individuals to seek out those substances or locations where those substances had been used. And lastly, and not only, we see it involved in advertising, where a neutral product is associated with people or objects or situations that consumers like and elicit a positive response. So we hope you'll buy our watch because Brad Pitt wears it and he's modeling it, and you will associate Brad Pitt perhaps in a more positive light, and so then that would be transferred or conditioned, if you will, onto our watch. Now, classical condition isn't the only historical perspective of learning that still applies today. We can have what's called operant condition. This was done by B.F. Skinner. And this is the type of learning in which the consequence of a behavior are manipulated in order to either increase or decrease the frequency of that response or shape an entirely new response. And so, for example, if you loved apple fritter donuts and I needed you to do some behavior, I could positively reinforce you with that donut to increase the likelihood that you're going to perform that behavior. Or if you don't have to use food, you could be using praise. So when you think about a reinforcer, that's anything that follows a response and strengthens it and increases the probability that it's going to reoccur. Now, what you can't determine very easily is what is positive for you is not necessarily what is positive for me. So even though you think you're not positively reinforcing a behavior, particularly, for example, in a child, you think that you're telling them that it's wrong and you're directing them that it's incorrect, don't do that again, and yet if that behavior is increasing, there is a positive reinforcer in there somehow that the child has determined as being positive for them. That's why the behavior is strengthening or increasing. Now, along with this work in operant are another term or another form of learning built off of operant conditioning. It's called shaping. And shaping consists of gradually molding a desired behavior or desired response by reinforcing any movement in the direction of that desired response. So, for example, how we do our writing is that we don't learn to write quickly and right away. We've learned through small incremental steps to get from little letters to big letters to a combination of big and little letters, all the way through our education to getting to where we could provide a handwritten cursive writing. So it's gradually responses are guided towards the ultimate goal. Now, successive approximations are basically a series of gradual steps. Now, when we talk about shaping, we're doing gradually molding the behavior, we're doing successive approximations, and by definition, these are gradual steps, each of which is more similar to the final desired response. So parents shape children by praising them each time they show improvement in a particular skill they're trying to demonstrate or have them do. Circus animals have learned all sorts of different things because of shaping behavior. Pigeons will learn to play ping pong or play piano because of shaping. Seeing eye dogs learn how to be seeing eye dogs through shaping behavior. Okay, let's carry on with reinforcement. There's two types of reinforcement, and they can get easily misunderstood. Positive reinforcement is any pleasant or desirable consequence that follows a response, increases the probability that that response will be repeated. Okay, that's an important note. Increases the likelihood that that behavior will be repeated. That's a positive reinforcement. Now, they can be any sorts of things, as long as the person receiving it views it in a positive way. Now, it's roughly the same as a reward, essentially. That if you smile as you walk down the street, people smile back, and you say nice things, and you want to smile at everybody. It's a reinforcing experience. Whereas negative reinforcement, well, this is where you might terminate an unpleasant condition after response. You increase the probability that the response will be repeated. So, for example, you see the faucet there. If you're in bed at night and you hear the faucet dripping, negative reinforcement would be to go and turn off the faucet so it's not dripping anymore, or turning on the air conditioning to avoid the heat. Heroin addicts will almost do anything to get another fix to avoid the pain of withdrawal. So negative reinforcement, the frequency of a behavior increases because it's followed by the removal of an adverse or unpleasant stimulus. So this is where we often get misunderstood. We think negative reinforcement is punishment, but in fact it's not punishment. And that's an important distinguish to make. Here's an example about negative reinforcement. Let's say you're studying with classmates to reduce the nervousness felt about an upcoming exam. And so this is what you're doing, and you're doing something proactive in this case. So the responding to test anxiety by joining a study group or study more and discussing the exam with other students helps alleviate test anxiety. Thus, the test anxiety is an important negative reinforcement. If you get test anxiety and if you get anxious about your test, then doing things about it to reduce it is called negative reinforcement. So when we think about reinforcement, we can think in terms of primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are reinforcers that fulfill the basic physical need for survival, and it doesn't depend on learning. So food, water, sleep are all examples of primary reinforcers. Secondary reinforcers acquire or learn through associations with other reinforcers. So we learn about the value of money, and that becomes a secondary reinforcer. We learn about the value of praise or applause, all as associations that we make later in our lives. They aren't something that are just unconditioned. We generally have to learn the value of them. And yet, it's often the secondary reinforcers that become very important to us when we are trying to do things. Now, when we think in terms of reinforcement, then if you're looking at it in a formal way, whether it be the way we're teaching our children stuff or the way we are doing things deliberately with students, we need to think in terms of schedules. Schedules of reinforcement determine which response will be reinforced and which response will not be. And so there's typically two types. There's continuous, which means you're reinforcing every single response that behavior you want to see is exhibited, or partial. And this occurs when correct responses are reinforced randomly or intermittently. And so schedules of reinforcements are like timetables. Now, when we think in terms of the partial reinforcement, there are schedules that are partial reinforcement, and there's fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Now, to make this a little less confusing, ratio means number of responses. Interval means amount of time. So when we look at the fixed ratio, we see that everything is done incrementally, one at a time, reinforced after a set number of responses. You see the behavior, you reinforce it. You see it again, you reinforce it. You see it again, you reinforce it, and so on. That's a fixed ratio. Whereas a variable ratio means that reinforcement is given after a varied number of correct responses. And it doesn't have to be consistently every second, every third, every fourth. It can be variable. So after the second time you see the behavior, you reinforce it. The sixth time you reinforce it. The ninth time you reinforce it. And so that's a different sort of a schedule. Now if we move to fixed interval, this reinforcement, you reinforce the first appropriate response after a fixed amount of time has elapsed. So let's say, for example, I would like to see a child smile at other children, and so I say, well, I will give a reinforcement for those smiling after every minute. I will count the number of times that behavior has occurred after a minute and reinforce after a minute. And then I'll do it again after the next minute and after the next minute. And it's a fixed interval. It doesn't have to be a minute. It could be 15 minutes. It could be an hour, depending upon the behavior and depending upon how frequently it occurs to know what's a reasonable amount of time to set as a reinforcement schedule. And then lastly would be the amount of time, which is the variable interval, which is you reinforce the first appropriate response after a variable amount of time. So the indicators there are of time. Okay? Now it's not, typically we're not using these in our parenting strategies, and yet these are things that we can be thinking about that will increase the likelihood that we can be successful at teaching our children the kinds of things that we want to teach them. So by way of an example, then punishment, this is the removal of a pleasant stimulus or the application of an unpleasant stimulus, thereby lowering the probability of the response. Now, that doesn't sound like negative reinforcement, and it's important to make that distinction. When behaviors decrease in frequency because of a consequence, punishment has occurred. Okay? So a couple of other behaviors that exist that we participate in that are learned. One is called escape and the other is avoidance learning. Escape learning is performing a behavior because it prevents or terminates an adversive event. Taking an aspirin to avoid a headache is called escape learning. And this is something that we learn. We learn about the value of, say, in this case, medication to reduce discomfort and pain. Now, avoidance learning, on the other hand, engages in a behavior to avoid an aversive consequence. You know, if my sitting in the room as a young child and coming to dinner when my mother's voice gets to a certain pitch or my father's voice gets to a certain pitch, this is me learning through avoidance learning. I want to avoid the consequence of not arriving when that voice gets to that pitch because I know the consequence is undesirable. Now, in this whole process of learning, some work was being done on what's called learned helplessness. This is the passive resignation to aversive conditions learned through repeated exposure to inescapable and unavoidable adversive events. So humans who suffer painful experiences they couldn't avoid, there was no escape, may simply give up and react to disappointment in life by becoming inactive, withdrawn, or depressed. Now, this is something that's hard to grasp. Well, how can you learn to be helpless? And yet, using classical conditioning, using operant conditioning, and the use of reinforcers, you can truly teach people to be helpless. When you look at people who have been in very abusive relationships, they learn to be helpless. Like there's nothing that they feel they can do to make that situation better, and they have learned helplessness. So applications of operant conditioning, one of the ones that gets the most notoriety in a lot of ways, and certainly is used in schools a lot, although it's used inappropriately and not scheduled correctly, is what's called token economy. And this is a program that motivates socially desired behavior by reinforcing it with tokens that can be exchanged for desired items or privilege. Poker chips and stickers and coupons are given with when a patient grooms correctly, or a child does chores, or there is interacting in a socially appropriate way, then positive behavior may stop when the tokens are not given. Now, another example on what gets incorporated is also called timeout, and this is where misbehaving child is removed for a short period of time from sources of positive reinforcement in attempt to extinguish the unwanted behavior. Now, both of these can work, but only if they're applied in a very strict and an appropriate manner. And unfortunately, in a lot of the ways that it gets used, it doesn't get used in a way that's going to have the desired impact that's wanted. And then lastly is looking at what's called observational learning. And this is learning by observing the behavior of another and consequences of that behavior. It often involves imitation, in which case there's need for a model, a person who demonstrates a behavior or whose behavior is imitated, or modeling, which is the process of observational learning, of another name for the observational learning. It's an improved learning when several sessions of observation precede attempts to perform the behavior. Repeat in early stages and practices of the behavior. So in a lot of cases, observational learning is that I just need to see somebody else do it and then be able to imitate them to begin to learn something simple or even something more complex. So here we are exploring learning. Now hopefully you've seen something in this that has maybe helped you understand some of the things that you've learned. Consider some of the habits you have, the good and the bad. How did I learn those? What associations were made? How were they shaped? You might wonder, in terms of things that you are afraid of, any phobias that you may have, how did that get learned? Because a lot of those are in fact just learned. So I hope this has been helpful. Good luck to you, and enjoy your reading week. And we'll see you when you get back.